Shalom and welcome to Now That We're Glad Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. This teaching is on Revelation chapter 18, and I've titled this teaching, The Deception of Babylon. I want to begin with a couple of personal questions. Number one, how do you manage wealth and possessions? And number two, how are you investing your time, your money, and your resources day to day? So we'll be thinking about these questions as we go through this study. Now we read in Proverbs chapter 23, verses 4 and 5, "Do not weary yourself to gain wealth. Cease from your consideration of it. When you set your eyes on it, it is gone. For wealth certainly makes itself wings like an eagle that flies toward the heavens." A powerful image here of wealth flying away. Wealth and riches are not evil in and of themselves. However, if one's sole purpose is in life is striving after wealth and the things of this world, then these things will become an idol which can never satisfy and will only disappoint. One of the pitfalls associated with the end times kingdom of Babylon is the great wealth that will be gained through doing business with this evil empire, as we read in Revelation chapter 18. We're going to go through the whole chapter in this teaching, and we're going to break it up into various sections to best understand what is written in these verses. So let's begin with verses 1 to 3. "After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illumined with his glory. And he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons, and a prison of every unclean spirit, and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality.'" This is the beginning of this chapter. Now, in the first verse, we are immediately informed that John has moved from the vision that he was seeing in Revelation chapter 17 to a different situation, right? John begins with "after these things." That tells us this is a different situation, right? And then he describes, quote, "another angel coming down from heaven." Now, the context in Revelation chapter 18 has moved from that fifth interlude in Revelation 17, where more information is given about the end times characters, and moves back into the prophetic narrative of the end times, right? We've seen this many times in the book of Revelation, including this fifth interlude in Revelation 17, right? More information is given about the people and the characters and the events in the end times. Now, the angel who descends from heaven here in Revelation 18, he's described as having great authority. He has great glory. The earth is illumined by his glory, and he has a mighty voice. This angel is possibly an archangel, but it never says that. But he's obviously one with great authority, right? Now, the message of the angel is clear. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. The entire chapter of Revelation 18 details the fall of Babylon in the end times. The angel describes the vile condition of Babylon the Great and lists reasons why she will be destroyed. I just want to list those out here. I'm just quoting the scripture as you see it, right? Just putting the phrases in here because it so succinctly describes the end times kingdom of Babylon. Number one, she has become a dwelling place of demons. Number two, a prison of every unclean spirit. Number three, a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. Now, I just make a little note here, because what does that mean? We can understand a dwelling place of demons, a prison of every unclean spirit, but what is a prison of every unclean and hateful bird? I'm not exactly sure what this means. It's possibly referring to birds like vultures who are unclean, who eat the carcasses of the dead. It could be referring to that. Moving on to the final three here. Number four, for all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality. Number five, the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her. And number six, the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. And it's interesting how these six descriptive reasons for why Babylon is judged are broken up kind of into two different categories. One, the first three is inside the kingdom, right, which is more on the spiritual side, going back to these first three, right, this dwelling place of demon, the unclean spirit, and the prison of every unclean and hateful bird, whereas the second three focus on the outside and those associated with Babylon, right? The nations, the kings, and the merchants, and they all are related and do business with this end times kingdom. The end times kingdom of Babylon will be a place of pure evil that will seek to seduce and infect every person and nation with its immorality and wickedness. That's the fruit of this kingdom. This declaration of the fall of Babylon and her relationship with the kings of the earth is an agreement with what we read in Revelation chapter 17 in the previous teaching, and contains much of the same wording of the first announcement of Babylon's fall in Revelation chapter 14, verse 8. We've read this verse before, but let's read it again. Where it says, and another angel, a second one, followed, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality. And we see the parallel there, right, with what we read in Revelation 18. Now, whereas Revelation chapter 14 and 17 are interludes providing the details, right, in between the active chapters, Revelation 18 explains the outworking of the destruction of Babylon in the end times. Now, the last phrase in verse 3 of chapter 18 informs us that great wealth will be obtained as a result of doing business with Babylon, right? We read that phrase, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. Now, I'm pointing this out because I think this is really a clear emphasis and theme here in Revelation 18. The majority of the text in Revelation 18 focuses on this business relationship. In fact, I have it noted here at the bottom, verses 9 to 19. This whole section focuses on business with Babylon and how all those different entities will do business with Babylon in the end times. We'll look at that more when we get to those verses. Let's continue in verses 4 to 8, where it says, quote, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues. For her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back even as she has paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mix twice as much for her. To the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuously, to the same degree give her torment and mourning. For she says in her heart, quote, I sit as a queen and I am not a widow and will never see mourning, unquote. For this reason, in one day her plagues will come, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for the Lord God who judges her is strong. So as we look at these verses 4 to 8, whose voice is speaking from heaven in verse 4? The text never identifies a particular person or being for the second voice in this chapter. It almost seems like Yeshua, or the Father in heaven, is speaking, since he says, my people, in these verses. However, we also see how God is referred to twice in the third person in these verses. The, quote, voice from heaven introduced in verse 4 continues all the way until verse 20. So it's the majority of the text and gives a long narrative regarding Babylon's judgment. I just want to point out here that there are three voices in Revelation chapter 18. The first voice is in the first three verses. The second voice is what we're looking at here, starting verse 4, going all the way to verse 20. And then we have this third voice, which will come in verse 21 to the end. So this chapter is broken up into these three main sections with these three different voices. So whose voice is speaking from heaven in verse 4 and going all the way to verse 20? And I just want to say this. After reading the text of Revelation 18 several times, I believe it must be the voice of God. whether it be the Father, the Son, or Holy Spirit. And just to say, I'm not the only one who thinks this. There are other Christian commentators who see this as well. And I think it's obvious as you get more into the text. Now, the reason I believe it is the voice of God is simply based on what we see in the text in these verses and how it is consistent with other scriptures. I'm going to share a few other scriptures, especially from the Old Testament. Now, in the book of Jeremiah, we read similar words of warning for God's people to come out of Babylon, as we see here in Jeremiah 51:6. Where it says, quote, "Flee from the midst of Babylon, and each of you save his life. Do not be destroyed in her punishment, for this is the Lord's time of vengeance. He is going to render recompense to her," right? So this is very similar to actually what we read in Revelation 18. Now, it is the Lord himself who is speaking in this verse in Jeremiah 51, because it says it in Jeremiah 51, verse 1. And he speaks of himself in the third person, where we read, "For this is the Lord's time of vengeance." But the Lord saying it. So in a very similar manner, Revelation chapter 18, verses 4 to 20, speaks of the judgment of the future kingdom of Babylon. And in verse 4, God warns his people to flee the city so as not to share in her sins nor receive of her plagues, right? And the Lord also speaks of himself in the third person a couple of times. Now, why does God call his people out of Babylon, as we read in Revelation 18:4 on the screen there? Why will believers be in Babylon in the end times? It is fascinating to see a call to the people of God to come out of Babylon because of the judgment which will come upon her. Now, we're not given any other explanation, but just kind of thinking about how this could be. Maybe believers will be prisoners there and they will be released as a result of the earthquake when the great city is split into three parts. It's a possibility. Whatever the case may be, there is a heavenly call for God's people to leave Babylon before the final plagues are cast upon her. Now, in Revelation 18, verse 5, we read of the heights of Babylon's sin, where it reads, quote, "For her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities." Now, this statement, "her sins have piled up as high as heaven," could be a reference to the original sin of ancient Babylon, when the people of Shinar tried to build a tower to reach heaven, which is speaking of the Tower of Babel, right back in Genesis chapter 11. In verse 5, we read how God remembered the sins of Babylon, which is clearly a reference to Revelation 16:19 and God's plan to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath, right? So we see all these scriptures working together. God then commands that Babylon be punished double for all of her wickedness, as we have already read in Revelation 18:6-7, but I'll read it again, where it says, quote, "Pay her back even as she has paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds, in the cup which she has mixed twice as much for her, to the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuously. To the same degree give her torment and mourning, for she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I am not a widow, and will never see mourning." Powerful words, right? The Bible is amazing how it just puts these words together in such a poetic and descriptive way. Now, we read a similar call of repaying ancient Babylon for all of her deeds back in the book of Jeremiah. We're going to be looking at a few different scriptures here. So Jeremiah 50:29 says this, right? This is ancient Babylon. "Summon many against Babylon, all those who bend the bow, encamp against her on every side. Let there be no escape. Repay her according to her work, according to all that she has done, so do to her. For she has become arrogant against the Lord, against the Holy One of Israel." Right, so again, this is 2,600 years ago, referring to ancient Babylon. Very similar judgment, right? Many of the Old Testament prophecies have a double fulfillment, and we call this telescoping. Prophecies which are fulfilled in the past, either in full or part, and these same prophecies can also be speaking of a future time, generally in the end times, as we're seeing here with Revelation 18 in Babylon. There's another example that we see in the book of Isaiah. Now, Babylon's statement about herself being a queen and denying widowhood in Revelation 18:7 is actually considered to be a quote from the prophecy in Isaiah 47, where we read, quote, Yet you said, I will be a queen forever. These things you did not consider nor remember the outcome of them. Now then, hear this, you sensual one, who dwells securely, who says in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. I will not sit as a widow, nor know loss of children. But these two things will come on you suddenly in one day, loss of children and widowhood. They will come on you in full measure, in spite of your many sorceries, in spite of the great power of your spells. There's a lot of things I've highlighted here. Clearly, the idea of being a queen forever, and she will not be a widow, right? We see that same phrase in Revelation 18. We also have the in one day there. We'll talk about that more because we also see that in Revelation 18, and also the many sorceries, right? And we see the sorceries as well being spoken of in Revelation 18. Now, to tie these verses together, we read in Revelation 18:8 how Babylon's future destruction will also come about in one day, right? I just mentioned this. And just to read Revelation 18:8 again, for this reason, in one day her plagues will come, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for the Lord God who judges her is strong, right? So it's almost like reading the same prophecies back in Jeremiah and in Revelation 18. Now, the destruction of Babylon, which is spoken about in the first 8 verses of Revelation 18, does not contain many details. We've basically read all the verses regarding Babylon's destruction. This judgment of God upon the future kingdom of Babylon, as presented here in Revelation 18:5-8, is clearly the fulfillment of the prophecy regarding Babylon in the 7th bowl, which we read in Revelation 16:19, which says, Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. Right, so that's part of that 7th bowl, and that 7th bowl is the destruction of Babylon. Right, so we have to see that connection here, going back to the 7th bowl of Revelation 16, and then the background information in Revelation 17, and then the fulfillment of that 7th bowl in Revelation 18. Right, so it's important to put this all together. Now, God's voice will go forth from heaven at the 7th bowl judgment to initiate the pouring out of his cup of wrath upon Babylon, as we read in verse 6. Once again, pay her back even as she has paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mix twice as much for her, right? So we see the imagery of that cup of wine, that cup of judgment, that gold cup that's in her hand, right? Now, God's cup of fierce wrath will be properly mixed to give Babylon double for her sins. As we saw in the previous teaching, the 10 kings and the beast will together fulfill God's purpose by destroying Babylon and burning her with fire. So let's read Revelation 17:16-17. This is also an important scripture in this whole judgment on Babylon, right? It says this, quote, and the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. Now, outside of these verses in Revelation 17 and Revelation 18:8, we do not read of any other specific verses about how Babylon is destroyed, right? So we basically get the majority of our understanding of this judgment on Babylon from these verses. The remainder of Revelation chapter 18 focuses on the reaction to Babylon's fall after it is destroyed. And that's what we'll see in the next section, beginning in verse 9. And we're going to read all the way to verse 20 because it's one continual section here. So let's read these verses. And beginning in verse 9. And the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, Woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet and every kind of citron wood and every article of ivory and every article made from very costly wood and bronze and iron and marble and cinnamon and spice and incense and perfume and frankincense and wine and olive oil and fine flour and wheat and cattle and sheep and cargoes of horses and chariots and slaves and human lives. The fruit you long for has gone from you, and all things that were luxurious and splendid have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them. The merchants of these things who became rich from her will stand at a distance because of the fear of her torment, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, she who was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste, and every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor, and as many as make their living by the sea, stood at a distance and were crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, in which all who had ships at sea became rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. Wow, powerful prophecy, right? Now, why do we read such a long list of various goods that will cease to be bought and sold as a result of Babylon's destruction, right? There's this great mourning over all of these items. Now, we read of three main categories of people who will mourn over Babylon's destruction. Number one, it's the kings of the earth who are immoral with Babylon and live sensuously with her. The kings of the earth who cooperate with the kingdom of Babylon in the end times will knowingly participate in immoral acts with her, right? Whether that be sexual or simply doing what is wrong, right? Immoral. Number two, we have the merchants, these business people who buy and sell her goods and thereby become rich because of their business with Babylon. And we have to think of CEOs, right? Chief executive officers of businesses, and all types of merchants will knowingly cooperate with Babylon in the end times for their own profit and gain in order to become rich and to obtain great wealth. Number three, we read about shipmasters and sailors and passengers and all laborers in the shipping industry who become rich because of the trade with Babylon. This third category of people focuses on the transportation industry, including the lowest laborer who is part of the transportation hub, right? Getting goods from one place to the other. And I just make a note here at the bottom. All three groups of people will mourn over the destruction of the kingdom of Babylon because their source of wealth and riches will be cut off. Now, as I was preparing this teaching, it was interesting to read this whole scenario about what will happen in the end times, about the great mourning over the loss of goods and riches, because I think we received a glimpse into this future prophecy as a result of the recent COVID-19 pandemic, which really covered from 2020 to 2022 and a little bit into 2023. Now, due to all of the shutdowns and closures in 2020, we had a huge disruption of global production and shipping in 2021 and 2022. With approximately 30% of global manufacturing based in China, a huge shipping crisis occurred globally. Ships were piled up at Chinese ports, waiting to get their goods, while millions around the world waited for goods in other countries. Now, I had this image on the screen, which is actually amazing because it's an image of at any given time how there are ships all around the world on the sea. And this is literally an image taken in time where all of the green and red and purple and blue dots are literally ships of some sort, vessels carrying whether it be goods or oil or grain, whatever it may be. And this is literally what a map of ships active in the world look like today. As a result of ships piled up at receiving ports with dock workers unable to process the huge influx of one time, we just had massive delays, right? Getting goods to where they had to go. Now, we were all able to see how one country, China, currently controls the majority of global production, right? Approximately 30%. And I'm not trying to say that China is the Babylon of the end times. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It doesn't matter. But we got a glimpse into that when we have one main source of production of goods and distribution of goods. Everyone wanted their goods. Merchants wanted to keep their businesses flowing for the sake of wealth and profits, and people wanted their stuff. The concern over the flow of goods for consumption and profit was uniquely highlighted during these months of the COVID-19 pandemic and the results that came down from that came about as all these lockdowns, right? Now, the long list of goods that is detailed in Revelation chapter 18, verses 9 and 19, emphasizes the end times focus on pleasure, wealth, and consumerism. Now, just to make a statement here that outside of the slaves and human lives, which are in that list, right, the majority of goods listed in those verses are everyday things that are part of everyday life. They're not evil in themselves. They're simply things in this world. But the end times kingdom of Babylon will be a commercial super hub that will be immoral and force humanity to submit to its immorality, right? To be part of its system. Everyone will be forced into it and will be dependent on it. And many will become wealthy as a result of partnering with this end times kingdom. The things of this world will be elevated above morality and the worship of the true God in the end times, even more than what we see today. I feel like what we experienced in the recent COVID pandemic is just a taste of the immorality amongst humanity that we will see, of focusing on what we can get and on ourselves. Now, I want to read 2 Timothy 3, 1-5, which speaks of the end times in a more general way, but it says this. Paul said to Timothy, "But realize this, that in the last days, difficult times will come, for men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Avoid such men as these." This is a powerful warning, right? Now, Paul's warning to Timothy begins to describe those who will deny God in the last days by choosing the pleasures of this world over God, over the truth. We know that no one will be able to buy or sell during the Great Tribulation without taking the mark of the beast. During the days of the Great Tribulation, many in this world will eagerly take the mark of the beast because they will believe in the Antichrist, right? And they will worship him as the Messiah. However, there will also be those who do not necessarily believe in the Antichrist, but they will give in to the pressure of taking the mark of the beast just for the convenience of being able to buy and sell in this world system. This is why God has given us a very clear warning. Do not take the mark of the beast. He told us what will happen, and he says, don't do it. Because in Revelation chapter 14, verses 9 to 10, it says, if anyone worships the beast and his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger, right? We have the warning. God is preparing his people to be ready for the end times and not to give in to the lie and deception of Satan. Now, I want to move on to this subject of the three woes that we see clearly in the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 8, we see the introduction to the seven trumpets, and we also read about the warning of the three woes in Revelation 8, verse 13, which says this, then I looked and I heard an eagle flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, because of the remaining blasts of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound. Now, we talked about this before, but again, I think it's important to see the fulfillment here in Revelation 18. Now, we see that there are three woes which are equated with and related to, in a sense, the three last trumpets, trumpets numbers 5, 6, and 7. In Revelation 11, we read about the second and third woes, right? So in Revelation 11:14, it says, the second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. And just to put that in perspective, right, the sixth trumpet has a clear ending at the second woe in Revelation 11:14. In the very next verse, the seventh trumpet is then sounded in Revelation 11:15, right? And that is connected to the third woe. Now, as we saw in our study of Revelation 11, although the seventh trumpet has a clear beginning, we do not read a direct fulfillment of the third woe of the seventh trumpet, right? This is a very clear relation in the book of Revelation here of these trumpets and woes. Now, I continually asked in my teaching on the seventh trumpet, where do we see the third woe fulfilled in the book of Revelation? And as noted then, I believe we only see the third woe mentioned in a creative manner here in Revelation chapter 18. Now, although we do not directly see the phrase, quote unquote, third woe mentioned in Revelation 18, we do read three sets of woes in this chapter. And we already covered this when we talked about the seventh trumpet. But just to review briefly here, right? I just listed the verses in Revelation 18 where we see those double woes, right? So the first one in Revelation 18:10, woe, woe, the great city, Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And you'll see a pattern here as we go through each one. Revelation 18:16 to 17, the second one, woe, woe, the great city, she who was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, for in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste. And the third one, Revelation 18:19, woe, woe, the great city, in which all who had ships at sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she has been laid waste. So the third woe of the seventh trumpet will be fulfilled when Babylon is destroyed and burned with fire by the 10 kings and the beast at the command of God. We see that clearly coming together here in Revelation 18. We also read how Babylon's judgment will come swiftly as expressed in the thrice repeated phrase 1 hour, right? So in the same way we see woe, woe 3 times, we also see that phrase in 1 hour 3 times. And just as the bowl judgments will appear to unfold rapidly, so too Babylon's destruction is said to occur in 1 hour. Now, this expression conveys the meaning of a very short time, whether it's exactly an hour, right? More than likely, it will happen that same day and very quickly, even as we read in Revelation 18:18. For this reason, in 1 day, her plagues will come, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned with fire, for the Lord God who judges her is strong. So we see a very consistent understanding here of the quick manner in which Babylon will be destroyed. So just to summarize this understanding of the seventh trumpet and the third woe, the days of the sounding of the seventh trumpet, which we are introduced to in Revelation 10:7, will begin as we read in Revelation 11:15 regarding the seventh trumpet, right? And are only fulfilled at the conclusion of the third woe, which will be at the destruction of Babylon in Revelation chapter 18. Now, although we see 6 full chapters, right, in between the blowing of the seventh trumpet and actually when that third woe is fulfilled, right? We see Revelation chapters 12 to 17, 6 full chapters in this section. The majority of these chapters are interludes, which provide further details of the characters and events of the end times, right? All Revelation 12, 13, 14, and 17 are all clear interludes. Now, in my estimation, the actual amount of days or weeks during the days of the seventh trumpet will be minimal, approximately 2 to 10 weeks. It's just a very short time. And I base this on the relatively quick succession of the seventh bowl judgment in Revelation 16 and the 30 to 70 day extension of the 1260 days that we read about in Daniel chapter 12. And just to remind us all, we are not given any exact time frames regarding the 7 trumpets or the 7 bowls. And I'm just saying this is my estimation, right? It's my opinion, but it's also the common understanding of most commentators as we see the quick succession of all of these events. And most likely the trumpets and the bowls, right? They're all probably in that last year of the Great Tribulation. Now, the final verse from the quote-unquote voice from heaven expresses the vengeance of God. So to read verse 20 once again in Revelation 18, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. So in the conclusion to this narrative of the second voice, which I believe is God, right here in Revelation 18, God invites heaven, the saints, the apostles, and the prophets to rejoice over Babylon's judgment. God's invitation to rejoice over Babylon's fall is in direct contradiction to the mourning over Babylon by those who will be part of the end time system, right? So the whole section we just read of 9 to 19, it's all about mourning over the fall of Babylon. God says, rejoice over this destruction, this judgment on this evil kingdom. Now, who is being addressed in this unique invitation to all of heaven? The saints, the apostles, and the prophets. It seems to be exactly who is named, all of those who worship the true God. And just to explain a little bit more, heaven seems quite general, all of those in heaven, including angels and the living creatures and all the heavenly host. And then regarding the other 3 categories, I believe God is expressing his full vengeance on the evil men and kings of this world who throughout history have persecuted and killed God's people. Just let me explain that a little bit more. So I believe God's even going beyond simply the end times kingdom of Babylon to the kingdom of Satan, in a sense, and the kingdom of evil. Because he talks about the saints, which I think are all of humanity who belong to God, number 1. Number 2, the apostles. And probably in this expression, it's referring to the disciples and those who were used to establish the new covenant, like the Apostle Paul. And I just mentioned here Ephesians 2:20. We'll read it in a second. And then the prophets, right? Especially the prophets as recorded in the Old Testament. And I reference Ephesians 3:5. And I just note here, because we see this phrase, the apostles and the prophets, used together in this verse, it seems more comprehensive, meaning spanning the generations of the Bible, right? As we read in Ephesians 2:20, quote, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Messiah Yeshua himself being the cornerstone, right? So all the prophets of the Old Testament who prophesied regarding the Messiah, and the apostles, right, who are part of that building up of the new covenant relationship with Yeshua, right? All of us who are in the Messiah, that foundation of the new covenant, right? So basically we have the old covenant and all of the Old Testament prophets, as well as the new covenant, all the new Testament apostles, right? So now we also read how Babylon is held guilty for all the slain of the earth, as noted in the final verse of Revelation 18. We actually haven't gotten there. We'll read the last four verses in a minute, but just to read this in the context of this, where Revelation 18:24 says, and in her, in Babylon, was found the blood of prophets and of saints, and of all who have been slain on the earth. So again, we see here how Babylon's guilt and judgment will be comprehensive, right? And I reference here as well Isaiah 24, which talks about breaking that eternal covenant, that everlasting covenant, and how it will be judged in the end times. Now, a response to God's invitation to rejoice over Babylon's judgment is seen in Revelation 19. We won't look at that right now, but we will look at that in the next teaching in Revelation chapter 19. So now let's just read the final 4 verses and bring this teaching to an end as we read here, verses 21 to 24. Then a strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, "So will Babylon the great city be thrown down with violence and will not be found any longer. And the sound of harpists and musicians and flute players and trumpeters will not be heard in you any longer. And no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer. And the sound of a mill will not be heard in you any longer. And the light of a lamp will not shine in you any longer. And the voice of the bridegroom and bride will not be heard in you any longer. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on the earth." It's the end of Revelation 18. Now, just to mention, the narrative moves from the voice from heaven, as we were introduced in verse 4, to a strong angel in verse 21 to the end of the chapter. And the strong angel now appears here, right? Now, Babylon's destruction is illustrated by a great millstone, which the strong angel throws into the sea. And just as a stone sinks in water and does not float to the top, so will Babylon be thrown down, never to rise again. In Revelation 18, Babylon is described with great wealth and luxury, containing all of the finest things of the earth, and great immorality. The angel describes how the musicians, craftsmen, industry, and celebrations which will fill the end times kingdom of Babylon will be silenced and never heard again. We never read about Babylon again after these verses in Revelation 18. That is it. It is finished. The reason for Babylon's influence over the people of this world in the end times is attributed to its deceptive sorcery. Quote, "All the nations were deceived by your sorcery," as we read in verse 23. Now, the word for sorcery in the Greek is pharmakia and means the use of medicine, drugs, or spells, right? Magic spells. Exactly how the end times kingdom of Babylon will deceive the nations of the world by its sorcery, by its pharmakia, is yet to be seen. Now, I believe that we have had a preview of how the deceptive sorcery, the pharmakia of Babylon, can potentially influence others on a global scale, as we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID vaccine, which was a drug, right, pharmakia literally, of 2021 and 2022 was thrust upon humanity, even we could say forced upon many nations on a global scale. Whether or not Babylon's end times sorcery will be attached to a vaccine, a drug, or something similar is difficult to say with absolute certainty, because that word can also simply mean a magic spell or some kind of evil influence. What we do know is that Babylon will be a deceptive influence over the nations of the world, controlling all economic transactions and deceiving the nations with the false hope of wealth and riches. We also see in Revelation 18 that Babylon's deceptive sorcery is set in the context of the global economy, as we read in verse 23, "For your merchants were the great men of the earth, because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery." Right? So it's in that context of doing business with Babylon. Our financial transactions and the manner in which we use our wealth is always important, and even more so in the end times, as we think about the end times kingdom of Babylon. Now, I just want to end with a practical application to this understanding of this sorcery and the way that Babylon will use its influence economically in the world. How one handles wealth and money reveals the intentions of the heart. We should always be wise with the wealth that God gives us and use it in a manner which honors Him. Now, Yeshua often taught about wealth and riches, and I want to just read one example of that from Luke chapter 12, verses 13 to 21, where we read this. Someone in the crowd said to him, to Yeshua, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter over you?" Then he said to him, "Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, The land of a rich man was very productive, and he began reasoning to himself, saying, "What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?" Then he said, "This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." How are we managing our time, our money, our wealth, and our possessions? Let us be wise with the wealth that God has given us and not be deceived by the lies of the enemy, especially as we approach the end times. It will be a true test in those days. This is the conclusion to Revelation chapter 18, the deception of Babylon. Here are some of the resources and commentators that I use in my preparation for this teaching. Please feel free to share this teaching with others. I also want to invite you to partner with us at Now the Reglai. We are a nonprofit organization, and we're fully dependent on generous donations from viewers like you. Thank you so much, and see you again next time.